right, so go ahead and open your Bible to 1 Peter. I put the, kind of in lieu of paper, like I did last quarter, kind of put the outline and schedule for our class on the board here. I have, in terms of the schedule, you can see today we're going to talk about both 1 and 2 Peter, and so you're going to have to remember 2 Peter and our intro to 2 Peter for 6 or 7 weeks. So just kind of keep it in your mind wherever you keep things that you remember for a long time until we get down here. But I'm going to go ahead and introduce it tonight. That just seemed the best way to divide the class up. And then on the first Wednesday in April, we won't have class. But other than that, it'll just kind of be steadily through the text each night. And then 2 Peter, we're just going to plan on covering a chapter, a class. This last class, I want you to be aware of this now. My plan is on that day, the 31st of May, I think it is, I would like to hear from you, and I would like that class to be much more of a discussion about what you take and what you feel is good or relevant or helpful to you from these two letters. So I plan to be a facilitator on the 31st of May, and if you guys don't have anything to say, then we'll all just stare at each other, and that'll be kind of awkward. So be thinking about that, and I'll remind you of that as that day approaches. But if we also, the good news is if we kind of run long in some of these classes in between, we have a little bit of buffer if we need to take a little time on that last Wednesday. Okay, so my goal tonight is to talk about these two letters, 1 and 2 Peter, which are two very different letters addressing two very different situations, and perhaps even two very different groups at different moments in time. And so I want to just start here with 1 Peter. 1 Peter 1 and verse 1 says, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to those who are elect exiles of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. So the first thing to notice there is that this is a letter that is addressed to a certain group of people. We always notice that. In fact, a lot of the letters, we name them as the group of people they're addressed to, like Corinthians, or we just got done studying Galatians. In fact, these groups, these place names in verse 1 are basically the same people. The people of Galatia, or the people of what we call Asia Minor. It's just a little broader area than just Galatia. And you see Galatia is one of the areas mentioned there in verse 1. So it's addressed to the elect exiles of the dispersion. So let's just take a minute with that. Who are these people? So this word dispersion, or I put down here the word diaspora, which is the Greek word that's sometimes used as a technical term for the scattered people. And the idea here is that over time, particularly in the time between the exile in Babylon and the time of Jesus, in that time, the Jewish people were sort of scattered out of their homeland, and they lived in a lot of different places. There were clusters of Jewish people in Egypt. There were clusters of Jewish people throughout the Greek-speaking world, and that was called the diaspora. In fact, they mention that in John, where one of the times Jesus says, where I'm going, you cannot come. They say, is he going to go to the dispersion, to the diaspora? Is he going to go to these people and go teach them? Is that what his plan is? Of course, they were confused. What does he mean when he uses this term in verse 1? I think it's important for us understanding the letter. It's not strictly the Jewish diaspora. So just because he uses that word doesn't mean he's talking about the Jews that have been scattered, because after all, he uses a couple of phrases that indicate he's also talking to Gentiles. So look at 1:18. He says, knowing that you were ransomed from the futile ways inherited from your forefathers, not with perishable things such as silver and gold, but with the precious blood of Christ. Okay, that idea of the forefathers having these futile ways, I don't think is a way he would have described Jewish people, to say that their forefathers were futile or their ways were useless. In chapter 2 and verse 10, he says, once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Now, you would not say that to a Jew. A Jew had been God's person before, been a part of God's people before, and now they still would be. But this transition, moving from not God's people to God's people, indicates to me he's not talking about Jews strictly. There might be Jews who are a part of that, but I don't think that's the entirety of his audience. So that makes me think dispersion is something different. There is a people here that he is addressing that is distinct from Jews and Gentiles. So You can see that here, where he says, now you are God's people where you were not before, but he also distinguishes them from Gentiles. Like, look in chapter 2 and verse 12, he says, keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable. Isn't that odd? It's like saying to Americans like us, hey, be sure and watch out how you act among Americans. You say, well, we're kind of all Americans, right? Okay, there's something odd about saying you're distinct from the group of people that you are. But that's what Peter is doing with this term, elect exiles and the dispersion. He is talking about a group of people that is not really Jewish and not really Gentile. They have a different identity. They are distinct from Jews and Gentiles. He uses a similar phrase in 4:3 where he talks about don't do what the Gentiles want to do. You spend enough time doing that. So what I'm getting at with this kind of long, winding statement here is that in 1 Peter, Christians are a distinct population, and they are identified as sojourners and exiles. What does the term exile mean? That's a term that my version, the ESV, uses. What does the term exile mean? You raise your hand.
Not home.
Not home, okay. Okay. What does exile mean in the biblical record? Okay, well, not in this world, okay. Think about Jewish history. What is exile?
They were sent out.
Right, you've been captured. You've been taken to a foreign land. You're no longer free. You're no longer where God put you. So you're away from not just your home, but you're also away from everything that you're familiar with in terms of religion, and you're away from your people. Okay, you are speaking a foreign language. All these things that had a very clear past referent. This is who they were. So the word exile here is an extremely loaded word. Okay, and what I want to ask you guys this question just generally. What does that make you, when we talk about that, and you guys mentioned some of the things that communicates, how would it make you feel to know that you are an exile and a sojourner? And what does that teach us about our faith? What's communicated here? What's the point? Yeah, Ms. Trish?
Well, physically, you're separated from everything and everyone that you know, and it's hard to make attachments that are that strong in a foreign land.
All right, so there's a separation there, and we're in unfamiliar territory, maybe even isolated on our own there. Steve?
I'll tell you what, if you were an older exile or an older sojourner, it's, in my opinion, it's a lot harder because for many years you've probably been used to having your same friends, your same people, your same familiarity with all these things, and now you're coming to the end of your life and you've lost that by becoming a sojourner and exile, and it's not a very comfortable feeling.
Right, so there was a lot that you had left behind because you had lived longer in your sort of natural state, and now because you follow Jesus, something's changed, where now your identification, who you are, has become something different. You're now isolated in a new way. Who have I got? Jim and Nisi, I think we got another commenting couple.
No, I'm just grabbing the mic for her.
Oh, okay.
I was just thinking of exile. My family's Cuban, and we're Cuban exiles, and there's something about having to depart and, coming to a new land where the culture is different, everything's different, the language, and so sort of as we become new and don't necessarily or shouldn't feel comfortable in this land because we're sojourners, because things should be different. And, for the exiles, for my family, that was forced upon them, and things were very different when you don't speak the language and it's a whole new culture. So some similarities there of not feeling comfortable we shouldn't feel comfortable in the world. Right.
There's a discomfort there because these are not our people. This is not our stuff. And I think that experience is what he's drawing on, that experience of being in a strange land. Usually, when you read the Old Testament, it talks a lot about foreigners and sojourners, but it talks about it from we're Israel and there are people wandering through our land and how we treat the sojourner and the foreigner. But then Israel itself began to experience this by going into foreign lands. I think he's pulling on that. The discomfort, I think, is a great thought, because one of the things he's going to mention here is there is a fear associated with the time of your stay. You're in a temporary place, here for a while. It's not a place to be comfortable. It's okay if you feel some tension because you're not from here. Somebody have a... Oh, he passed. Okay. Well, I got to talking. So, all right. So, other thoughts on this? I want you to think about how this, if you were to be addressed this way. I want to talk to you guys as sojourners, as people who don't belong here, as outsiders, as foreigners. That conjures up some pictures in our minds, and it gives us some fuel for how should we be thinking about ourselves. I want you to look at this with me in 1:17. It says, "If you call on him as Father, who judges impartially according to each one's deeds, conduct yourselves with fear throughout the time of your exile." Think about that, okay? You've got a time here, you're here for a little while, and there is a certain attitude that you take with it. There's an alertness, there's a strangeness, and there's perhaps even a danger because we're not at home. And so there is all of that rolled into one in this idea of being an exile and sojourner. Somebody have a hand up over there. Yes, Ms. Trish?
Some of these people were probably from Jerusalem and had just become converts, and now they go to a foreign place where they don't have a congregation. It would be very easy to lose your faith just because you don't have anything in common with anyone.
Yep.
And that goes for us too.
Yep.
Choosing where we want to live. I think sometimes college students have to make that choice when they graduate and get that first job. I may be able to make more money in town A, but there's no church within 100 miles. And that's something that they should think very seriously about.
Right. Well, what you're drawing on there is the idea that when we feel isolated and we feel like we don't have people, it weakens us. And we take strength from the people around us who can encourage us and say, this is who we are and this is what we do. And so being a sojourner and an exile kind of takes all that strength away, so that now we're really isolated, standing on our own. And there is some weakness exposed there. Yeah. Scott?
I think if we really felt like we were a sojourner in exile, then we're going to seek out people like ourselves, like the church, and being with people of like precious faith. So when I think about what does it teach us about our faith, we're going to try to be around people because we're not comfortable without in the world,
right? Because
we're in exile. We don't, feel comfort. I mean, I think when we think of our country and people that have immigrated, why do we see people that have immigrated settle in communities together? Because they're comfortable, because these people all share something. So if we really felt like we were in exile as part of this earth, that we don't belong here, then I think we're going to seek not to be company with the world, but to be company with people of the same faith of the church.
That's a very good thought, because when you read stories of immigrants that come here, especially those that don't speak English, they will talk about how refreshing and welcoming it is for them to hear someone speak their native language, whatever it is, whether that's Spanish or Eastern European languages or whatever. These are my people. This is my language. They seek out that, and I think we have that same impulse, or we should, if we really view ourselves that way. Who we got? Claire?
I think with what we've talked about, with a sense of danger and a sense of fear and alienation, that means that at the end, when there's this homecoming, this idea of a homecoming, there should be relief and joy that we're looking forward to.
Right. That this is only a short time that we're here, we're going somewhere, and that's what we're looking forward to. Not to be comfortable now, but the homecoming. I like that idea, that we'll be with our people and with our God, and all of this, the tension that we live in will have ended. I think it's good to have a name, a picture for the tension that Christians live with. I think we all know, when I say that word, that there is tension in the way we live amongst the people of the world. It's not that we don't love the people of the world. It's that there is just sort of a fundamental worldview difference. And there is a fundamental differentiation between us, that leads to us feeling a little bit of uneasiness. And I think that's part of what he is calling us for, or calling to our attention here. Yeah, Dick?
That makes me think of your 117 comment a moment ago, where the New American Standard says, conduct yourselves in fear during the time of your stay upon earth. And the word fear there is, my notes say, phobos,
Yeah.
the word that we get terror from.
Right.
And I hear that saying to me, you need to be on edge
Yeah.
while you're going through this period of time, looking forward to the time that you don't have to be on edge.
Right. That's it. Very good. Okay, let's keep working in kind of introducing the letter. In 5:13, Peter mentions that, or at least he says he is sending greetings from those in Babylon. And that has led to all sort of speculation, depending on, in fact, sometimes it affects how you read Revelation. How you read Revelation in Babylon there affects how you read how you read 1 Peter 5. I am going to go with probably, I'm thinking Rome, and I think Babylon probably means Rome. But then there are some people that argue, well, Peter was never in Rome, and that becomes a whole other issue. I'm going to leave that for tonight. He describes himself as a fellow elder, which is an interesting detail we don't get anywhere else. That Peter evidently was, wherever he was, located long enough and in a role that is a little different from just being an apostle, that he serves as an elder and he calls the other elders to account and tells them, here are some instructions that are elder-specific, and we'll get to that in chapter 5. He also says he's a witness of Christ's sufferings. He's going to talk about that in 2 Peter as well, but that's an important idea because Peter, again, is telling them and speaking from experience. He was there with Jesus. Okay, the main reason, and one of the things you always look for when you see a letter in the New Testament is what's going on that prompts the letter. Why is this here? And the main reason for the letter is that Peter knows that suffering is coming. And I put a whole bunch of references there. We're just going to keep coming up on this over and over and over again. He wants them to be ready for what is ahead, and he is very frank that this is going to be hard. He wants them, I don't want to spoil it. I'll tell you about that in a minute. But if you just want to write those down or take a picture or whatever, we'll get to those as we go through, and we're going to talk a little bit about them a little later in the class tonight. But I just want you to think about this. And this is a question I do want you to answer. If you knew suffering was coming, you knew something bad was going to happen, and the bad is not really specified, although I think it's strongly implied that it's persecution. But if you know suffering is coming to someone, especially a younger Christian, what would you say to them? I do want you to answer. What would you say? What would you be concerned about? What would you want to give them? Alert, okay. What's the thinking there? Why would we want to alert them? So they could be prepared. Okay, so what's the preparation? How can we be prepared? Y'all see what
I think all of us, to one degree or another,
I was not prepared for that.
Have experienced, that happens. We all experience suffering of one sort or another.
Right.
Kind of telling. I'm coming up on my 50-year high school graduation. So far, they've identified 84 of our graduating class that have died. In going back through it year by year, some of them died not too long after we graduated. Today, when I come across somebody that is suffering, which sometimes not too long ago we had somebody, 9-year-old son that got lost in a car wreck, other people with cancer, my father with COVID. The answer from myself is always the same. The only comfort we're ever going to truly receive is in the Bible. The only comforter is God and the Holy Spirit. So we can come up with a lot of answers, but in the end, there is one answer, and there's many inside that one answer, but there's one answer.
Right. We still do, don't we? When you come across those people, you want to try to, you say something, like there is some effort, even though I think you're right. I think ultimately we comfort minimally because it's God who's the true source of comfort. And we can point people to things. But I want you guys to think through what do we think would be helpful in a moment like this? And there's a reason I'm asking, because I want you to think through it, and then we'll notice how Peter addresses it, maybe in a little different way than we would expect. Jim?
Yeah, so Nisi and I we love World War II movies, right? It's great to have a wife that loves war movies. But I think the thing that intrigues us about it is, we think, what must it have been like to be in America during World War II when there was this atmosphere of you just don't know what's going to happen. You don't know if your country's going to last. And so it's very intriguing. But, I think of the term war footing. Even at home, we were on a war footing, and we were literally fighting to save the world. And I think I would say to our kids in that generation is that we're fooled into thinking that we are living at peace with Satan, when in fact there's this war raging in the spiritual realm. Even as we sit here tonight, the devil is going about as a lion, seeing who he might devour. And so I would tell them, look, you need to be on a war footing. Because we are at war. There will be rest one day. God's going to win this war eventually. We may or may not be here, but he will win. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's this atmosphere of, we're so fooled in this country of prosperity that we think we're at peace, because that's what we see around us if we only look around us. But we need to be thinking in terms of what's going on in the spiritual realm. What is reality? Mm-hmm. In essence, it's not what we see around us; it's what we can't see. Right. So,
and because there's evil at work, there are times when that evil will sort of break through and affect us, right? And suffering will be a part of our lives because we are understanding it. So you're thinking, I want to prepare them and sort of get them bracing for that by saying, this is a reality that you can expect, and this is just a part of the way the world is because we're at war with evil. Yeah, Shannon?
Especially for a new Christian, it's important to emphasize the eternal hope that we have, and to not, especially if you know suffering's coming. I think a productive way to prepare them is to say, this is temporary suffering. Remember, this is temporary.
Right.
And that we have something far better that is eternal.
Right.
So helping give them something to keep a focus on.
So it's a time thing. We can put up with a lot if it's for a short time, right? If we know that the time is limited. In fact, one of the things that's most distressing is when we don't know how long we're going to have to suffer. But no matter what, it's only as long as this short life that we have. So looking forward past that as a comfort to say the time will come when this won't be true anymore. Peter's going to do that very thing and talk about, though now for a little while, if need be, you've been grieved by various trials. Rachel? Oh, I'm sorry. Am I overlooking Phil? Phil's got the mic. Go ahead, Phil.
I should allow my sister-in-law to go first.
No, you
Okay.
go.
Okay. Well, the two things I think about being prepared along this is that when we're surprised by something, our reaction is different than when we have prepared, or at least have something's coming.
Right.
Okay, so our reaction is different to that. And in that same sense, to remind maybe someone younger that suffering isn't permanent, is that we get something from it. We gain something from it. It's hard to imagine that we gain from it, but we do.
Right.
We gain some strength or ability or knowledge or something. So we can look forward through that idea that it's not permanent. I'm going to gain from this.
Yes.
That's what I would tell them.
So there could be something good even though it seems bad, and also your idea, we react differently. That's what I was going for a minute ago when I kept asking, what's the point of trying to prepare people? How do we prepare them? We prepare them by them knowing this might happen so that when it comes, they respond differently. So he's going to say in 4:12, do not be surprised at the fiery trial which is to come upon you, which is exactly what Phil is saying. Don't be surprised. Why? Why is it such a big deal? Well, it's because if something surprises you, don't you sometimes react poorly? Okay, like if something startles you, sometimes you scream, where if you knew it was coming, you wouldn't scream. Sometimes you may even, say words you shouldn't say or react violently or, something like that, just because you're surprised. So here is a way that Peter can comfort them beforehand, and we do that too. We would do that to a young Christian and say the same thing. Yeah, Rachel?
Like all of the things people are saying, like the word that comes to me is encourage, and you're instilling in people courage, and you're pointing them to God so that they can have that comfort. Right. We need courage, and that's something we can also give to each other, which is a really cool thing, because that's what that word encourage means. Yeah, go ahead, Tyler.
I think one of the practical things we can do is we know saints in other parts of the world that are going through persecution much harsher than we are now. Get our young Christians to talk to them. We have folks like Billy Kumar come over who has been beaten, who has gone through many, many things that we just can't imagine, because America is an abnormal blip in history with prosperity and the peace that we have, even when the rest of the world is not. And so my mind just immediately went to, from a practical standpoint, get them talking to other saints who do not have it as physically well off as we do.
Yeah. Peter's going to talk about that in 5:9. He says, resist Satan, steadfast in the faith, knowing that the same sufferings are experienced by your brotherhood in the world. All over the world, people go through suffering. We all do it. Now, we have our different form, and you're right, it's a blessing to be here where persecution is few and far between compared to some places in the world. Or it's limited, or it's totally different, or it's just, mild, we might say. And that's a blessing, and I don't look down on that. But it does help to say it doesn't have to be this way, but also if I do suffer, I have solidarity with other people. I'm not the only one. And I think that would be something I would tell a new believer. So let me... I would say it this way. What would be the greatest concerns you would have? I think you know what I'm going for here. Like the great concern we would have, if you talk about a new believer, and I'm assuming that these people are younger believers, and that may be an assumption that's unwarranted, but if you have a young believer, don't you worry that the minute it gets hard, they will walk away? If you have ever worked with someone and led them to Christ, and seen as their little heart begins to open up and they start these little steps of faith and they're excited and they're joyful and they start to make changes, and then maybe their family comes down hard on them. And you worry. Are they going to quit? And so when you see that, you go to them to encourage them and you say, look, this is part of it. Look, this happens. Look, your faith is worth this. Look, I understand. But whatever you do, you use all of these words because when you look at that situation, you know this is a pivotal moment for them. If they falter in the suffering, then it could be the end for them. And you don't want that. So now I feel like when we have that perspective, we can understand what Peter is saying. And we can understand the perspective from which he is writing. Who have I got? Ms. Trish?
Along with what you were saying, you kind of crossed over what I was going to say, but they need to be reminded of the resources that they have. Mm-hmm. This is going to happen, and it's happened before, and so has gone through this before, and you need to keep your prayer life going even stronger and your studies, so they have some place to go for help when they start feeling the pressure.
Right, and we lean on each other in that. And there is some of that, too, in 1 Peter, where there is a stress on the idea that because we're suffering, and we might be suffering together, we need to be unified as a local church, as believers in Jesus, that we don't fight each other. We show love to each other, and we're working together instead of it being we're picking at each other and we're fighting the world. That would be overwhelming. So I want to talk to you a minute about Peter's themes, and this is one that I think it was Phil touched on. One of the major themes of 1 Peter is that suffering can bring a blessing. He knows that this is coming. He wants them to know it's coming, not just so that they don't fall away, but so that they can go through it looking forward to what this can do for them, what this makes possible for them, how it sharpens and betters them. Now, a lot of New Testament writers make this, but I'm not sure anyone does it as consistently and as emphatically as Peter does in this letter. So I'll give you some examples here. In chapter 1, he talks about how it is like a testing, like when you test gold by putting it through the fire. And he says, in that way, the genuineness of your faith is shown just the way the way they would refine gold would be to melt down and remove the impurities so that the gold itself was all that was left. But to get to the impurities, you have to pass it through the fire. And you can hear how that correlates to our lives, that we go through hard times, and in doing so, we test the genuineness of our faith. So that when we come through the trial, we know. I mean, wouldn't it be a strange thing if we continue serving the Lord all through the suffering, and then as soon as things get easy, we quit? See, something has been proven and shown, demonstrated, tested, and it's the genuineness of our faith. So we have confidence, and also he talks about how that faith then gives praise and honor and glory to God. God has produced something in me that makes me different from other people because I keep going even when I suffer. Suffering can be a blessing because we're following Jesus' example. This is one of those sermons that probably hardly ever gets preached in our time. But New Testament writers all the time talk about when we go through hard times, it just makes us more like Jesus, because Jesus went through hard times. And he actually says in 1 Peter 2, Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow his steps. You walk where Jesus walked. You suffer like Jesus suffered. Paul talks about, I want to know the fellowship of his sufferings, which means I want to share in his sufferings. So I think the way we typically talk about Jesus' sufferings is, sure, I'm thankful Jesus suffered for me, and now I don't have to suffer. That's the way we think about it. But the New Testament writers say, no, when I go through something, I'm just like him. And now I'm more like him. I'm closer to him because of that. And they consider that a blessing. He talks about how unjust suffering is gracious. And he's contrasting that in chapter 2. If we suffer and it's our fault, that's not really a noble thing. When you suffer because you did something foolish or wrong. But when you do good and suffer for it, he says it's a gracious thing in the sight of God. Insults actually bring a blessing, is his logic in chapter 4, verse 14. When you're insulted for the name of Christ, you can rejoice because you know it's actually the Spirit of glory and of God is upon you. And somebody made this comment, I think it was Tyler, it connects us to our brethren throughout the world because the same sufferings are experienced by them as well. So there is a lot here that's good that Peter looks at and says, don't think that this is a sign something has gone wrong. The temptation is to think when we suffer that somehow God has failed, or somehow the promises of the Bible are not true, or somehow God's not helping, or God's forgotten about me. And he says, no, that's not it at all, but there is a more mature way to think about suffering. And so we're going to keep tracing these thoughts all throughout the, quarters? Throughout the quarter as we study this. But I want you to hear and see that's where Peter's mind is, and that's the same way we talked about what would we say to a new believer. This is what Peter says, I want to say to a new believer as they go through hard times. Yep, Miss Debbie?
I was just going to add, people don't try to take things from you that aren't valuable. And I think if we help each other remember and help the younger Christians remember, they wouldn't be coming after you if there wasn't something valuable that they're trying to take from you. Don't let them take it. Right.
So if it wasn't a big deal, it wouldn't be this hard, that kind of thinking. And so the fact that if we want to talk about it as Satan, Peter talks about it as Satan, like Jim brought up a minute ago. In chapter 5, this is the passage that says Satan is walking about like a roaring lion. But if you want to talk about it as people, it's the same idea. It's that our faith is important and valuable, and we don't want to sacrifice that just for our comfort. Okay, other themes in 1 Peter. Peter has a lot of thought about having a good reputation and influence among unbelievers. Especially, he connects those two things together, and I'll show you this in a second, that how you suffer affects your influence. People watch how you go through hard times, and that reaction that you have can earn you a hearing from people. People want to ask a reason for the hope that is in you. Why do you act that way? Why are you not afraid? Why are you not upset? How can you do this? And they want to know. It draws them in. He also talks about not living according to the lusts of the flesh, keeping your conduct honorable among the Gentiles, honoring the king, honoring the people in positions of authority over us. In this letter, it's slaves and masters, it's husbands and wives, and it's government. And all of these are put in the frame of, if you do these things, think about the good it can do as people watch you. And they see that. In chapter 4, he talks about they're going to watch you what you don't do, and they will make fun of you. They'll malign you because they see your good works, and in some way it makes them feel bad. It makes them lash out at you. And he also talks about suffering as a Christian and glorifying God in the name of Christ. Another theme is that we change when we become Jesus' disciples. There's a fundamental break. Something new happens. And Peter argues this way several times. I put a bunch of them on the board. I'm not going to go through all of these. But the idea is, when you've been born again, you love from that pure heart. When you put away certain things, you put on certain things, you become a different person. You find a new example that you follow. You think about things in a new way. You're not afraid like you were before. You honor Christ as Lord in your heart. All these things tie into the fundamental change, the shift that happens. I think that this is something we tend to forget, because for many of us, especially if we've been a Christian for a long time, it doesn't look like a Apostle Paul moment where you're going all against Jesus and then all for Jesus. It looks a little different. The story looks different. But most of the time in the New Testament, you have people who come out of a lifestyle that is evil and into a Christian lifestyle. And so there is a night and day, bright line difference. And Peter talks about that a lot. We'll come upon that as we study through. Peter also has a lot to say about honor and subjection. And we'll talk about subjection or submission in chapter 2, because there's an extended section about it, and it's pretty controversial today. And so we'll get into that as we go. Just know the basic idea here is that we have a way of influencing other people by submitting ourselves even to people we don't agree with, even to people who do us wrong, even people who are flawed. There is also this honor element, that there are people that we honor who are over us, like honor the king, honor the governors. A husband shows honor to his wife. And these are ways that we fight against what the surrounding culture, the world that we're in exile among, tries to force us into. That we're going to say, no, I will honor the people who deserve honor, not because they're honorable people, but because I have honor and respect for God. So I will submit to them. The last thing I want to say about Peter's themes is that Christian community, and especially love, is essential in hard times. When you see in 1 Peter him talk about how we act as brothers and sisters, I want you to have that feel to it. He says at one point in chapter 4, the end of all things is at hand, so be serious and watchful in your prayers, and above all, keep loving one another. Love covers a multitude of sins, and show hospitality to one another, and serve one another with your gifts. I get the feeling like he is saying, we can't afford to turn on each other when bad stuff's going on outside. We need each other, and we need the community to be what's going to have that good reputation and earn us a hearing among those outside. Okay, so Peter's main message is that suffering can be endured, and that our holy lifestyles and faith in the face of suffering will have an impact on the watching world. If I were to sum up 1 Peter in like one sentence, that would be it. that when you react the way you should and you live the way you should, you can have an influence on the world. All right. Let's turn to 2 Peter real quick. I've got 4.5 minutes. 2 Peter is entirely different. A totally different tone. We're not talking about suffering in 2 Peter. There doesn't appear to be suffering on the horizon, except in the sense that there are some difficult people who will come into the picture that we need to watch out for. There is also no specific local audience, so there's no elect exiles of the dispersion like in 1 Peter. Merely those with faith of equal standing, or the old King James says, like precious faith. That's a phrase that we kind of hang on to today. So 2 Peter has a last words tone. A last words tone. Peter is approaching his death, and he says in chapter 1 that he's about to put off his body. And so he knows he needs to write some things down so that people will know and remember what he had to say before he's gone. For one, that's a testimony thing. He's got some testimony to give still about how he was an eyewitness of Jesus. He talks about the transfiguration in chapter 1. He's got some testimony to give, but also, you just think about, like, if you've ever had an experience of being with someone who was on their deathbed, and how you listen to them, especially someone who is an older person who has lived a long life faithful to God, you want to know, what do they think? What do they think is important? What matters most? What would they say if I only had one or two things left? What's the last words on their lips? So I love it because we get that from Paul in 2 Timothy. And he gives us I have fought the good fight, I have kept the faith, I've finished the race, and there's laid up for me a crown of righteousness. Just awesome. Where you say, that's that man's last words, because he is dying in confidence. Peter has last words. And I want you to think about, as we read 2 Peter, how we would listen if we knew that we were at Peter's bedside, all the things he could talk about. And he says, I just want to talk to you about a couple of things, some things you need to be careful about. So let's talk about what those are. Peter's themes here, one is keep growing. Don't stop. And he talks about this list of virtues in chapter 1. Because God has enabled us, he's given us everything that pertains to life and godliness, we need to respond to that by making every effort or all diligence to add to our faith virtue and knowledge and godliness and self-control and brotherly kindness, love, all these things. Because how sad it would be for God to have opened the door of the treasure room of heaven and we say, I don't think it's worth it. He says, you keep growing, you make your call and election sure, so that you know that the entrance will be abundantly supplied to you. He also talks about in chapter 3:18, you keep growing in the knowledge of the Lord. Remember the testimony of the eyewitnesses. I mentioned that earlier. Don't forget, just because these people are going to be dying, don't forget what they said, and don't forget that it's still true. And so he talks about that in several places. He says, watch out for false teachers, which is all of chapter 2, and we'll talk about that when we get down to that section. But Peter is concerned that some people are going to come and lead people astray and perhaps even enslave them in some new things. And so he says, watch out for them. It seems like Peter knew, perhaps through the Spirit, that this was going to happen. He wants them to be careful about that. And then in chapter 3, it's don't let scoffers undermine your faith. Scoffers is different from false teachers. The scoffers seem to be unbelievers. But they are people who especially are skeptical about the idea that Jesus will come back. And they say things are just exactly like they've always been. How do you know Jesus ever came the first time? How do you know any of this is true? Things just look the same. The sun goes up, the sun goes down, and the earth just continues to spin, and everything's the same. And he says, don't let that undermine your faith. So it's easy to read them like that. Think about an old man at his bedside whispering that as his last words. That's what I want you to get for 2 Peter. So put that in your memory and hold on to it for like 6 weeks until we start studying 2 Peter. And we'll pick up there. All right, thanks, guys. We will start with 1 Peter chapter 1, Lord willing, next week.